I have two types of founders that call me and ask questions. One of them is they have started their company maybe 2-3 years ago. They have about $1 million ARR, just so you know the size of it. They have zero AI, and like that, now they're thinking, like, I need to bring AI features in. I need to put Copilot here, some chat, and some, uh, all that stuff. Like, I need to pretty it up and then with the AI so that I can be treated as AI company. The other ones, in the same area, like again, like let's assume $1 million ARR, they're thinking, okay, I like these LLMs are a different mindset, different world. I need to change my architecture from ground up before it's too late, because every day I'm creating technical debt for my future.
Right.
How do I restructure the whole thing and think about? So you're very technical. You have some great articles on how AI works. So can you tell us like how you think we
Sure.
can advise our audience a little bit?
So first of all, due warning, I'm fairly opinionated in a particular direction around the quote unquote AI universe. I actually, I'm an enormous fan of what the new generative technologies can enable, but I am very skeptical about even the term AI. I mean, the best definition of AI I've ever heard was a very poor choice of words in 1954. And just by way of background, I mean, I've been observing the AI universe. I entered the AI universe, so to speak, with Marvin Minsky at MIT in the late 70s. And what he was calling AI was entirely different. It was about a theory, a computational theory of mind. It was philosophy, more than anything else. What we call AI now is generative models, specifically generative models. That's what they are. They're based on the same core technology that machine learning was based on and has been used since, for the last 15 years. Sometimes people would call it machine learning AI. And by the way, one thing you should ask yourself, are you using machine learning adequately in your platform? Before you worry about generation, there's a lot of things you can do if you have a lot of data with machine learning. And it doesn't require generative models. The place where you get into, if all you're trying to do is pretty up and add quote AI into your mix for investor pitch decks, I don't have too much to add to that. Go forward, be happy. I don't ask me to look at it because you won't get a good result. But if you are seriously contemplating what can I do with these new models, it isn't a light lift, first of all, because they work very differently. You depending on how you've architected your system, you may have to completely re-architect large pieces of it. Most of what the magic in using AI is all about the software. There is an AI that goes around the model. The model is, I mean, this is something people lose, and they get very confused when they talk about, the coming super intelligence and all that. Most of what's going on is happening in the agents, the software around the model. That's the real work. The way you use the LLM is, first of all, as you're using the agents around the model, is you're building up something called a context window. I'm giving you a brief underpinning of what this actually is. And you're doing that by retrieving data from various places, and you might use the LLM to guide you through how to do that. Now, you can already see that that's a different architecture than a pure transactional architecture. It's many iterations on a single query just to build up and gather up the right information to generate a final result. Now, the nice thing about the final result, and the reason to use these techniques, is you can produce a much more customized, adaptive result, depending on what you're doing. You can also control things, but most of the folks who are doing this these days, at the moment, are using it in some kind of a modified chatbot form. And so, for example, they might be building a human resource system that previously, if you went into the human resource system and tried to find out how your coverage in a particular set of circumstances worked, you'd get back a pro forma answer. They direct you towards some document which you'd try to read and make sense of, and you'd be on your own. You'd end up calling somebody to explain it and all of that. The opportunity with these new technologies is to build a system like that that actually goes out, gets your policy, gets all the related material, analyzes it in some sense for you, and produces an actual answer for you, maybe a manual that's completely customized to your circumstances. You can do that with these generative models. That's the beauty of them. They have the ability to generate actual language and to reason in some sense in a loosely structured reasoning over a whole bunch of material to figure out what's relevant. So, that's a reasonable transition to make, but as you can see, it's an entirely different platform. If you consider that human resource platform case, it's two entirely different platforms. One's just going into some document management system and pulling out documents. And as a result, it can only let you do very limited queries because it only knows how to find documents in a very limited way. Now, I warned you I might go on for a while.
No, it's great. Yeah.
Whereas, with this more with a generative model with an LLM in the mix, and the agent that knows how to cycle and use the LLM to build the context, you can pull all kinds of useful information and then reason over it in a customized way for this user. What you can't do, and this is where a lot of people get confused about AI, I'll use the term generative model if it's okay, so that I don't offend myself by saying AI. What a lot of people are confused about is they think they can just throw in a model and it will learn all about you. And that's not what happens with LLMs. They are GPTs, and that stands for Generative Pre-trained Transformer. Forget the generative part we talked about. The transformer part is irrelevant. The thing I'm getting to is the pre-trained part. Once you train them, they're just there. They don't know anything from query to query. Everything else happens outside of them. So this notion that you're just going to throw an AI in and it's going to go discover customized answers to things on its own isn't the case. That's why the architecture changes so much, because you have to build this agentic framework that interacts with the generative model and actually does the work of building this context, because the model itself is not learning anything about from query to query. And that's an important thing to bear in mind. Anyway, go ahead.
No, it's okay. So, where do people start? There's the ways that you can improve the user interface as user experience. Then there's the area that the backend system where you can remove the business logic that you work so hard to build, and replace that with this generative AI.
Depending on the nature of the business logic. For example, if you have a completely transactional platform that's just you're buying something and that part of it, you don't really want to mess with that, because that needs to be repeatable and exact. When I buy an item, I want it to go through a precise cycle. Now, to find that item, to search for that item in a more free-form way, you might get some benefit out of it. You really need to ask yourself, you need to understand, okay, I can do this sort of more customized generative approach that opens up the queries from a narrow set of queries to sort of open-ended free-form queries in my world. What do I want to do with that? That's how I'd recommend starting. So again, in the case of the HR system, just to keep using that as an example, if you're going to set out to do that, you say, well, okay, the problem I have right now is all I can do is return a document to somebody who wants something from me. And that never really works very well for anybody. So I want to digest the document and produce an actual result. That's my goal. Now I have a goal, and it makes sense. I'm not just throwing AI in there. I'm throwing AI in there, or generative models in there, because I want to get from just spitting out documents to actually spitting out the information somebody is looking for, and not just a sort of fixed set of questions, but they can ask me anything about the subject.
Yeah, this makes sense. So the way I advise people that are calling me about these, again, and we're assuming it's $1 million ARR business, seed going to Series A type, right? at this stage, your job is either provide a solution that is 10x better than what's out there, so you can disrupt them, or find a technology for the same problem you're trying to solve, but do it in ways that it's never been possible before.
Mm-hmm.
So I think like again, it needs to focus on, in my mind, the problem that the customers have,
Mm-hmm.
and how do I solve that problem in ways that was not possible before. Does that make sense?
Yeah. The thing is that if you have if you've built yourself to $1 million ARR with a product that is genuinely innovative and new and solves a whole new class of problems, so you're already on an arc, and you didn't, assume generative models to begin with, there's a good chance that this isn't a good time for you to suddenly say, "Oh, I better throw in some." And again, unless you're doing it for window dressing, there's a good chance that you will mess up your arc if you do that, and you might want to wait for the next when you're ready for your next major generation to re-architect it and fundamentally expand, what you can do. Because if you remember from our last conversation, I just entered a market. Good news. I figured out how to get into this market with a product that people will actually use, get by their objections, all of that hard work, and they're actually using it. And I'm now at the subtle point where I'm trying to say, all right, I got into the market with 5% of what I really wanted to do, but it's got people using it. Now I need to start ramping that up. That's your job. And
not to throw away and then restart
right,
all over again, because just getting that stage was already a
you
huge.
worked so hard and had to do so much thinking and planning. You need to execute on moving that forward. Is that the right time to switch horses and fundamentally change your offering?
Keith,
You might want to start thinking about it, but
yeah. But I have also experienced personally that many times when you launch the initial product, even if it's 5% of what you want it to be, it's not enough. And so you start desperately seeking to augment with some AI. I think that's more regular. That's more likely to happen.
So if in the scenario we talked about last time, if you recall, the notion was you already knew what you really wanted to do, right? And you came into the market to get into the market with something much simpler.
Mm-hmm.
So then you don't have that problem. If you got into the market and that's all you had, and then you have that problem regardless of whether you're using AI or not. True. So the problem is not an AI or a generative model problem. Right. The problem is you didn't think through what you were going to do for your second piece. Right. You'd better get moving on that, because if you're lucky enough to have gotten to the market with whatever it is and you don't have something in mind already, you'd better figure it out. It may turn out that you need to use generative models or you want to use, that it's a good idea to use a generative model. But there's you're likely to either do something so different or throw away so much of what you've got.
Yeah. I think like having access to customer at any stage, right? Whether you're $1 million ARR, 10 million, or $100 million, if having access to customers, giving you feedback, giving you the information like about their challenges, what they are fed up with every day, what they would love to have to make their lives easier. Like I think like as founders, it's our job to listen, whether you're listening to 5 customers or 100 or 1,000, right? Continuously find ways to improve that, and hopefully through using the latest technology, your job is a little easier to solve their problems in ways maybe sometimes they can't even explain. Right? Like that's the goal, right? Not to throw away everything. Oh, I'm just going to start this new shiny object because stuff from the technology.
Now, having said that, if you weren't thinking about these new models, the generative generation of these models, when you started, then you probably weren't using them internally either. So one thing you can and should do, these are really great tools. I use ChatGPT as my personal research assistant for all sorts of things, and I don't know if I ever really trust it, and I never use it to do a finished product of any kind, but boy, does it save me time, either on the research side, making sense of, you get some feedback from a customer, you're trying to make sense of it. Talk to ChatGPT, let it go out and search the web for all the references and all the competitive products that this person may be seeing and whatever, and tell you, and give you some insight. You'll save a lot of time. You'll be able to respond a lot faster. I'm not a big fan of pure vibe coding, as they call it. If you're familiar with that, I hope I'm sure.
I've been doing it, love it. I can't sleep because it's like I'm hooked.
Okay. I have used, coding and generative models to assist me in coding. I never just say, go build this system. But, I've always been someone who, I don't hold all of these libraries and how they work in my head. I've always depended on Google to tell me these things. And with ChatGPT or GitHub Copilot or any of these other tools like that, you just skip a whole lot of pain of looking up examples, and it generates an example that is close to what you want. Yeah. Again, I wouldn't trust it to just take it and slap it into production, but it certainly saves you. So again, there's the point I'm trying to make is you don't have to put it in your product to be using these tools effectively. You can use them in your internal process. You can encourage some companies. Yeah. People are afraid to acknowledge that they've done it. I would say, go, please save a day on your next sprint, right?
Mm-hmm. Smart.
Ask whatever model you're using to do the first pass on this code, and then just take that as your starting point. Please. So there's more than one way to get that stuff into your universe.
Awesome. Great. Thank you.
And the line of questions I had from our last time, particularly with your technical prowess, having started so many businesses on the development side, what is the delineation when you start a business and you're starting to code between when you hire people permanently in-house versus using offshore versus using nearshore? Because that's always a topic, because you don't have money, you don't have resources, you have an idea, and you may or may not have a technical person on your partnership side. How does it work? What's the best way to do that?
So I have my preferences, and some others do things differently, but I always tell people, find a small number, 2, 3 very strong engineers, and hire them and make them your anchor. And with that team of 3 or 4 strong, I mean, when I say strong engineers, I'm not talking about somebody who's got 5 years of experience. Well, I shouldn't talk in terms of years of experience, because that's not always accurate, although it often is, but it isn't always accurate. But you want the kinds of people who you don't have to tell them what to do. Mm. They'll do the right thing, and they won't go off and do something, on a tangent or whatever, because that's another problem you can have with your early team, is people who, are just going off in random directions. These are, if you hire the right, strong people, they'll understand what they need to do. They'll ask you when they need to know, well, okay, what's the real purpose of this part of the system, or something like that. But once you tell them that, and once you give them the general direction, and you give them the parameters that you think are important, they'll just do it. And they'll understand how to explain what they've done. And if you do that, then you have some freedom about where to go next.
So what you just said is, regardless of your money situation, you highly recommend that first-time founders pay, cajole, bribe talent on the
kidnap,
right?
Whatever it takes,
whatever it takes. Pizza, up to 2, 3, 4 talented people.
I would say 2 to 3 is probably all you need. Okay. And to some extent, it depends on just how technical. I'm biased. Most of the projects I work on they're heavy lift kinds of projects, where the code, the technology is the heavy lift. A lot of businesses, that's not true. And I'm not really prepared to speak to those. There's a lot of businesses that are just building fairly generic software underpinnings because their magic I'm actually working with at least one company that is where their magic is not anything heavy in terms of technology. It's the fact that they've understood that in the world of building certain kinds of consumables, there's a lot of spare capacity, and if they harness that, they can do on-demand. This happens to be bespoke furniture, and it turns out that the way this stuff getting by, like the cabinets you put up in your kitchen, that all have to be custom. And they've realized there's all this spare capacity that they can just grab and so you don't have to go to some other country to get it all built and wait weeks. Great. There's no real technology there. It's the technology is trivial. It's the fact that they've realized that they can grab this stuff. Okay, they could probably outsource from the day one. They don't need anybody really strong. They might need somebody to advise them so that they don't do anything really stupid. But there's nothing. It's a website with a database and a little bit of logic around it. It's not much. Okay, fine. They can outsource from day one. They don't need this stuff. But that's not my typical bailiwick. That's not what I tend to do. So if you're building a brand new IoT concept or a security play that is massively complex but solves a problem in a way that wasn't done before, or any something, you're dealing with heavy lifting, you need that strong team internally. So
That's great. Thank you.
Yeah.
So how I'm jumping to the next one. Keith, what I see sometimes, there's an eagerness to hire a lot more people in the engineering and product and delineation area. Like I think sometimes the founders see these titles these big companies have, even like the growing startups. There's the chief product officer, which is chief technology officer. And like I sometimes, like even VCs recommend these, hey, you're just going to be growing, so you better start hiring these people.
There's
right?
a lot of investors. We've talked about investor pressure the last time. There's a lot of pressure you'll get from your investors that is not necessarily good for your business, right?
Yeah.
And
so can you talk about these? Like sometimes all you need is VP of engineering, and then the founder talking to customers and then getting it done. You may not need these.
I would say what you need is a CEO who is good at business development, and who understands the product. You don't need a sales team per se, because you're not selling. You're probably not. Again, I'm talking about these relatively technology dense companies that are doing truly disruptive things. You're probably not selling in an open way. You're probably doing more like business development, very selected, targeted sales to a few key anchor customers, right? So you don't need a sales team. You want a CEO who can do that, preferably without handing it off. And the CEO will hopefully have the full vision of the company, fully embedded in their brains, as will the CTO. If you have a good CTO, the CTO can do, my take, product and technology. If you've hired the strong engineers, they don't need as much management. You don't need a VP of engineering yet. You will, but you don't need it yet. You can rely to some extent on those engineers. If you bring in, let's say you hire 2 or 3 strong engineers, and then you hire an external team for some of the lighter lifting, maybe the front end, the portals that you're building, you can outsource them, depending on just how subtle they have to be. There may be some standard kinds of integration and shims you need to build, and you might outsource them, right?
So Keith, give us some signals or guidelines the founders can look like. Like there's a $1 million ARR business with 3 engineers and 1 CTO, and if you scale that up to, there's a CTO with 200 employees, 50 engineers, like the full marketing development. that is a huge range.
Mm-hmm.
And then some people will whisper your ear, higher, 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 higher. But what are the signals you can say, okay, if you see this, then hire this person. If you see that, hire this person.
Right. So if you're starting to get ARR of any significant, I mean, a lot of companies get by on some NRE, that they might scrounge up. That's not what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
But if you actually get, unless you're dealing with a company that will do very large NRE that looks like something else. I mean, I have seen, multi-million-dollar NRE, quote unquote NRE packages that are really investments of a sort.
Yeah.
But when you get to the point where you've got a product out there and people are paying for it, you need to start thinking about expanding your team. That is a good time to start expanding your team some. Whether or not you need to go to sales yet depends on what your funnel looks like from your early biz dev work. You still may have enough activity there. You don't really want to start selling broadly, because when you start selling broadly, the requirements that come in will start becoming significant, right? And that then you really will need to scale up, and you may not be ready because you're still working on some core things. But the point where you've got something in the market and people are using it, as a minimum, you're going to start having lots of bugs to fix, and you're also going to start having lots of feature tweaks. Mm-hmm. You'll have major things you want to do, but lots of feature tweaks that don't require the level of skill to implement necessarily, but you want to do them quickly. And so you may consider at that point, adding in either junior engineers to do some of that work or outsourcing to do a lot of that work under the watchful guise of your core team. Now, it's a trade-off there, because you will be relying on your core team to guide these folks. You might consider at that point bringing in a VP of engineering when you're bringing in these external resources, because you do have to put some process in place. The strong team I'm talking about doesn't need as much process.